Thank you so much for being here with us today, everyone. My name is Amanda Graham. I am the academic director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. And we have been hosting, with the partnership of these wonderful institutions, a series for the past year, actually, on titled New Energy, as you know, and featuring a whole range of folks who are early stage in their careers in energy and society research engagements. And so we are delighted to have our very short summer series with two talks. This first one today is with Trisha Shrum, who is an assistant professor at the University of Vermont. And I will introduce Trisha in just a second. And then we'll hand things over to her. The way that we'll proceed will be to have Trisha give her presentation and then make sure that we have a good chunk of time, 15 or 20 minutes or so at the end of our hour together for you all to submit questions to us, I believe through the Q&A. And so please be thinking about your questions and feel free to pop them in any time while you are listening. So welcome to Trisha, our neighbor in the northern New England region, based at UVM in Burlington, Vermont. Trisha is the assistant professor of community development and applied economics, or an assistant professor in the CDAE at the University of Vermont, and she is a behavioral and environmental economist. Her background includes both environmental science and policy, so she brings a rigorously multidisciplinary perspective. And her background also includes a stint working at the Kansas Energy Office and in founding an NGO called Dear Tomorrow, which is a climate storytelling website organization that I encourage you to look into. Her work is thoroughly empirical, which I think is a real advantage in this space of figuring out humans and how they work. Her work has also addressed intergenerational impacts, as well as looking at behavioral and environmental decision-making behaviors and what influences those behaviors. Her PhD is from the public policy side of things at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her master's is in environmental science from Yale, and she has both a BA and a BS from the University of Kansas in environmental science and biology. So Trisha, you are going to lead us in a journey on endogenous preferences, intrinsic motivation, and the evolution of pro-environmental behavior. So please take it away.
Right. So let me share my screen here. Okay, can you guys see my initial slide?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, I just want to thank you all for having me. This is a great opportunity to talk to you all. Be great to see your faces as well. But it's great to be here. And today I'm going to talk about some recent work of mine, and the title is a bit unwieldy: Endogenous Preferences, Intrinsic Motivation, and the Evolution of Pro-Environmental Behavior. So I'm going to break that down and explain what that means, and tell you why it's important for climate change work, for energy work, and for understanding pro-environmental behavior, or really all sorts of pro-social behavior in human beings. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to go quickly over the theoretical background, including explaining some of these terms that I'm using. Then I'm going to go through the experimental methods. So I conducted a randomized controlled experiment to test some of these theories and add to the overall theoretical understanding of these questions. Then I'll walk through my results and then circle back with some conclusions. So let's see, let me just set a timer so I don't go overboard on keep myself accountable. Okay, so first with the theoretical background, let's start with this idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is basically that you do something because you really want to on an internal level. So it's intrinsically rewarding. So the example is, you're reading a book not because you want to get an A on your paper in English class, but because you happen to be developing a love for Jane Austen, which is my favorite author. And intrinsic motivation is something that is often developed over time, but drives behavior for internal reasons. Now, extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is behavior that's driven by external rewards, such as money, fame, grades, praise, whatever it is. So this is where, you're studying to get that A. You're not necessarily studying because you want to further your knowledge and just because you're curious about the subject matter. And of course, there's always everything is a spectrum. So you can have both at play, but we're going to look at isolating the effects of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation through a randomized control study. So let's bring it, because I'm an economist and I have that background in economics, I like to use economic theory as kind of a basis to help organize how we're thinking about these things. And that's useful. Economics, there's plenty of criticism about how we oversimplify things, but sometimes it's nice to have a clear theoretical basis. So when you're looking at intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, what really matters when it comes to economic theory is that most of the time, we're looking at static utility theory. And this is basically, economics 101. People respond to incentives by increasing that incentivized behavior. So if I give a subsidy for electric vehicles, you're likely to see more people purchase electric vehicles. But dynamic utility theory takes that timeline and says, we're not just interested in what happens when you add that incentive. We're interested in what happens after that. How does this incentive affect behavior in subsequent periods? So, with dynamic utility theory and relating that to what we know about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation from psychology, provides that cautionary, the caveat that people respond to incentives by increasing that incentivized behavior, but in subsequent periods, they might reduce that incentivized behavior or, just at least not continue it. So, if you have kids and you're trying to get them to do chores, this is probably something you're familiar with. If you pay them, if you dangle a dollar bill in front of someone, then they're going to chase that dollar bill. I can get my kids to do all sorts of chores if I pay them to do so. But the question with dynamic utility theory is not just like, yeah, they're going to respond to that incentive. But the question that I'm interested in is what happens when there's no dollar bill? So if I pay my children to do the dishes, if I don't pay them, are they going to say, I'm not doing anything? So this is a question that's super relevant for policy as we're figuring out how to design policy that's going to affect behavior and understand what kinds of dynamics might occur under different types of policy designs. So my big question here is, under what conditions does performing one environmental behavior increase or decrease the likelihood of performing additional behaviors? And this is often called a spillover. So in other words, when do you get a positive spillover? When do you get a negative spillover? And when do no spillovers arise at all? So first of all, just a moment on pro-environmental behavior spillovers. This is an area of study. In fact, I think it just 2 weeks ago, I watched a talk by Greg Sparkman, who gave a really nice overview of this topic. And negative spillovers are basically, you also hear this as like rebound effects or take back effects. They tend to be more likely when that initial behavior is motivated by guilt or some other sort of negative affect, and you're just trying to kind of shut down the guilt and put down the flag, as Elke Weber puts it. It also tends to happen when you're motivated by an extrinsic reward. There's relevant theories to this: negative spillover, single action bias, moral licensing theory, rebound effects, etc. Now, positive spillovers are more likely when that initial behavior is motivated or aligned with your identity and moral values. It's also motivated by an intrinsic reward. And granted, like behaving in line with your moral values in a way that says, I'm a good person, is its own type of intrinsic reward. So there's definitely, and there's different ways that people break this up, but this is kind of an overview that covers the bases pretty well. Relevant theories to this is self-perception theory, cognitive dissonance theory, which is how I initially got interested in this topic long at the beginning of grad school, long ago, and consistency theory. You want to be consistent, especially when you're being observed. So there's a number of really good reviews on this, and it's a growing area of literature that's generated a lot of interest. So this idea of intrinsic reward, the literature's kind of come to call this warm glow. And so what is a warm glow? It sounds so nice and fuzzy. A warm glow is defined as the positive feelings that one experiences when they act for the benefit of others. And economists translate this into positive utility. So James Andreani in 1990 began this term in this area of study by asking the question of like, if we are all self-interested, then why do we donate to charitable organizations? So there was a big area of study under just trying to explain in a utility model how doing things for other people translates into that economic utility model. Warm glow is, it's a very fuzzy concept, but you can also measure it in brain scans. So that's exciting. Harbaugh and et al. In 2007 measured, put people under a scanner and measured the neural response to it was like a taxation or voluntary giving to charities, and found like in the little pleasure center, a reward processing center of our brains, it lights up when we give to charity at all, even if it's mandatory, but it's even stronger when you give voluntarily. So warm glow and pro-environmental behaviors is an area of study that's really been blowing up over the past 4 years. Researchers are increasingly studying the role of warm glow for climate change and other pro-environmental behavior. There's a great review by Zawadzki, and we're finding that not only is this a driver, it's a driver of climate change engagement, it's anticipated warm glow is a stronger predictor of pro-environmental intentions than the perception of the kind of actual environmental benefits that you get out of it. And there's a lot of studies in this review, we're finding that warm glow is actually one of the strongest drivers of pro-environmental behavior. And this has been, pro-environmental behavior is a really interesting, difficult area of study because we're finding like sometimes attitudes predict behavior, but not fully. Sometimes opinion predicts behavior. It's a bit of it's still a pretty open question of really understanding what drives this behavior. So warm glow is increasingly being examined as a promising area to just say, as I like to sum it up, like it feels good to be green. And also, even just from a policy perspective, in an economic model, Hunt Alcott and his co-authors modeled optimal energy taxes. In fact, found that including warm glow or other types of what they call biases in the utility among different types of people changes the optimal level of taxes that we should have in order to get an optimal outcome. So that brings us to the term endogenous preferences. So just first of all, the second part of the term, preferences. To any economists in the room, this is like a normal term. For the non-economists, it's really pretty simple. It's basically just reasons for behavior. So why do you do what you do? And endogenous preferences. So normally in economics, or just traditionally, let's say, we economists say your preferences are given. Like you bring your preferences to your economic decisions, and then we're going to model those decisions. We haven't traditionally looked under the hood to say what's driving those preferences. And we can get away with saying we don't need to look at what's driving the preferences by saying those preferences are exogenous to the model. Like they don't, if I'm trying to model a policy or an incentive, then the preferences that you have are what matters, and we're not looking at the dynamics. We're just looking at the policy intervention. So it says, you bring your preferences, we'll bring our policies, and then we'll see what happens. But the problem with that, especially for a problem like climate change that is long term, you all know that what I do today is not really all that matters for climate change, because these, when emissions are accumulating and staying up in the atmosphere for decades or centuries, those long-term dynamics become extremely relevant. So endogenous preferences say, wait a minute, if we have a policy or an incentive or some sort of scenario where prior choices or prior policy interventions affect your preferences, then we're missing a lot if we don't include those in the model. So that says endogenous preferences say we need to look at how our interventions actually affect the way people make decisions and the way they form their preferences. And then I kind of bring this out into like an evolutionary concept. My degree in evolutionary biology and ecology affects my thinking in terms of looking at this as a long-term development of preferences over time. So with the endogenous preference model is something that has been discussed for quite a while. Recently, Mattauch, Hepburn, and Stern have developed a model that explicitly puts warm glow into the model of endogenous preferences. So basically, to sum this, to go fairly easy with the math, if you have a choice between two behaviors, X and Y, let's say that X is driving to work and Y is biking to work. Each behavior has different environmental impacts, F of X and F of Y. And we define warm glow by saying, if you choose the behavior that has lower environmental impacts, then you also get this additional utility bump that says, I feel good, I get utility out of doing the thing that has a lower environmental impact. So, we assume a utility function with a constant, the basic assumptions of the utility model. If you take this idea of warm glow and add it into the model, then to put it simply, like everything else equal, if you have a stronger warm glow, where alpha I2 is greater than alpha I1, if everything else is equal, consumers are going to maximize their utility by doing more pro-environmental behaviors if they get more utility out of that warm glow from doing pro-environmental behaviors. So it's not rocket science, but it is nice to be able to create this clean prediction from a model, which then also allows us to put it back into things like measuring optimal taxes and things like that. So I guess we don't interrupt with questions, but if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to go back to it. You don't have to you don't have to fully gather that, and if you're welcome to look at the paper for more details. So with that as a background, hopefully you have a pretty good idea of what I mean by intrinsic motivation, warm glow, and endogenous preferences, and this idea that we're interested of pro-environmental behavior spillovers. Also, I abbreviate pro-environmental behaviors as PEB, which is the term that's often used. So now I'm going to look at our experimental methods. So I use an online experiment, and if you're familiar with online experiments, you've probably heard of MTurk, which is basically a marketplace where people come on to do small jobs for small payments, and taking surveys is one thing that is pretty common. So I recruit people via MTurk. I recruit, about 450 people. I end up with 379 in the final study. It's a two-part study. And so in the two parts, first I just ask about their pro-environmental behaviors that I'm going to measure to try to get a baseline. And then I have an experimental intervention, which I'll tell you about in a second. There's three groups: the intrinsic treatment, the extrinsic treatment, and the control group. I ask about a couple questions that creates the warm glow index, which was established by Sander van der Linden. And then I ask about intentions to perform pro-environmental behaviors. 1 week later, I follow up and I say, hey, all those pro-environmental behaviors I was asking you about, can you tell me like how frequently you did those? And if you're interested a little bit, just briefly about the pro-environmental behaviors I asked about, I talked about, did you, use a plastic disposable bottle? That would be a negative behavior. Did you make an effort to turn your lights off when you left the room? Did you use disposable products? Did you look for climate change information? Did you bring your reusable bags? What I was focusing on was things that you could easily change over a short period of time. So there's definitely, these are not the most important environmental behaviors, but in 1 week, you're unlikely to have like invested in a new washer and dryer set that's more pro-environmental. So we're looking for behaviors that are more easily kind of variable over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the end, because this is an area that really needs some more work. Okay, so that's the general overview. Now, the experimental intervention, basically, we have people do this effort-based task. And to be honest, like the task doesn't really matter. It's the important thing is that they have some level of choice of how much effort they put forth. And in this task, we have them transcribe words from this word cloud, and we pay them 1 penny per word that they transcribe. So, I think they have to sit there for about a minute, regardless of how many words they transcribe. But they're welcome they can stay as long as they want and go into the smallest font size. And I will note that the resolution was better on the actual experiment. So they write all these different words, and then the treatments are different. Each treatment group has a different payment structure. And that's the key of generating these different intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So with the intrinsic group, for every word, Juliet, Romeo, all the other things, every word you write down correctly, you get 1 penny donated to a pro-environmental group, Trees for the Future, which plants trees that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's it. You don't get any money. You just have to do it out of the goodness of your heart. The extrinsic treatment is you, for every word you write, 1 penny goes to Trees for the Future, or and then 1 penny goes to the person who's actually doing the work. And I will note there's some level of choice with the environmental nonprofit that gets the money, because you have to have some level of control. That's an aside. But so you choose between 3 groups, but I tried to find a really boring non-environmental group to try to nudge people to do the environmental group. So some people were interested in raising funds for the Vermont Historical Society, but most people chose the pro-environmental groups. And then the control group just says you get a penny for every word you can transcribe. So we had 3 treatment groups. There was about 150, 120 people in each treatment group. And yeah, so they wrote about, so they were able to choose how much, and then we see what happens. So these different treatment groups are designed to, this intrinsic treatment is only generating, like the only reason that they're going to do this additional behavior is out of the goodness of their heart to try to raise money for this nonprofit. The extrinsic treatment they can be doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but they also have another reason for why they're doing it, kind of like getting paid for, good grades or getting paid to do your chores. Like you might still feel good about it for other things, but you're also getting money for yourself. And then the control is there's no environmental nonprofit mentioned as part of the motivator. Okay, so what do we find? Sorry, I'm going to go back to that. So we find that the intrinsic treatment increases that anticipated warm glow. So remember we were asking about, would you feel good about doing something good for the environment or reducing your impact? There's a couple questions there that's part of an established index. So we find that 1 week later, the intrinsic treatment has a much higher level of anticipated warm glow than the control group or than the extrinsic group. And interestingly enough, and I was surprised by this, they didn't develop this higher level of warm glow right after the experiment. So right after the experiment, they're pretty even, but 1 week later, they have a major difference. And this is just to give you a little bit of understanding of the scale here. This is on a standardized scale where um, the mean is 0 and a standard deviation is equal to 1. So we're looking at about a third of a standard deviation difference in the warm glow index among the intrinsic treatment group. The extrinsic treatment does not show any increased level of warm glow. So we see 0 effect on them. And so we can show, like, first of all, we know that we have successfully kind of generated the intrinsic extrinsic motivation and the outcome of like, wow, it really actually increased how much they appreciate doing a pro-environmental, doing something good for the environment. And interestingly enough, this is the first that I'm aware of. It's the first experiment that has like manipulated this idea of warm glow. Most of them just measure it and then see how it affects other behaviors. But in this case, we're actually trying to induce this feeling of warm glow and measuring the effect. So that's one cool contribution of this work. Also, if anyone, we can go back to the regression tables and stuff. I try to just keep it without tables, but those are available. So we see this effect on warm glow. Now the question is, so our hypotheses, like participating in this effort-based task increases that anticipated warm glow for the intrinsic group, but not for the extrinsic group. So that confirms those two hypotheses. Then the second question is, does participating in these pro-environmental behaviors change their likelihood of carrying out additional pro-environmental behaviors? So we find mixed results on this one. One thing we do find is that intentions are significantly increased among the intrinsic group. So compared to the control group, which is this 0 line, the intrinsic group increases their intentions to perform pro-environmental behaviors. It's a smaller effect, but it does it actually increases a little bit 1 week later. So it's a small but sustained effect that people who were in the intrinsic group are now feeling a stronger urge or a stronger intention to carry out pro-environmental behaviors. And the extrinsic group, we see no treatment effect, which is what we expect. Now, just to kind of give some context here, most studies that look at, that experimentally measure different interventions to affect pro-environmental behaviors, a lot of them stop at intentions and they measure intentions. And through the theory of planned behavior, there's a large literature that says there's a strong connection between intentions and actual behavior. But I wanted to take it a step further and try to measure actual performance. And that's where we don't see the effect that we would predict based on this theory. So, I guess maybe it's like a little bit positive, but it's very small and it's not significant. And then you see this a little bit of like a negative movement from the extrinsic group compared to the control. So they're very small effects, which, given that a lot of the behaviors are habitual, like, and that they raised, in the intrinsic group, I think they raised an average of like 70 cents for a pro-environmental behavior, and they worked for like 4 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever it was. I'm not shocked that we see small effects and completely insignificant effects. But it's a little, it definitely sheds a little bit of doubt on the results. And that's the thing that I want to really nail down in future studies. So we see the effect on warm glow, we see the effect on intentions, but then performance, given what we measured and what we asked about, we don't see that suddenly people are taking the bus to work instead of driving because they are, because they, helped raise money, helped raise, a dollar for a pro-environmental group. So that's interesting. So I take it a step further and I use what we call causal mediation analysis. And basically this is a method, this is an analytical method from the psychology literature. It's very common in that literature. And it breaks the total treatment effect into a direct effect of like the treatment variable on the independent variable, which is our pro-environmental behavior. So it says there's a direct effect of the treatment to the outcome, and then there's an indirect effect of the treatment through this other variable. And I use the mediating variable of warm glow to test whether this indirect effect is occurring. And, here's the math. You get, the key thing is that you have a structural equation mediation model. And then between these two equations where you're predicting the warm glow based on the treatment, and then you're predicting the outcome of the behavior based on the warm glow and the treatment, then together you get basically it's A times B is the mediated effect or that indirect effect of the treatment on the outcome, the pro-environmental behavior, through that warm glow. And I have pictures in a second. It'll help a little bit. So basically, to take this back to that model that I said, based on this model, the MHS model, it says that if you have higher utility from doing pro-environmental things, then you're going to increase the proportion of pro-environmental behaviors that you exhibit. So this is testing that key proposition, is saying, okay, if you increase warm glow, then do you see that shift in behavior? And with the mediation analysis, you find that the indirect effect, so what this says here is that the intrinsic treatment increases that post-treatment warm glow. And then that post-treatment warm glow is associated with an increase in the post-treatment reported pro-environmental behaviors. And what we find is that the entire effect goes through the warm glow variable. So we call this, fully mediated. And the indirect effect is significant while the direct effect is not significant. It's small. You're looking at a 6% change in your post-treatment pro-environmental behaviors. So, there's a little bit of, I would caveat these results a little bit. I think that's it's promising and shows exactly what you would think it would show if this initial proposition is true. And it also is supported by a lot of literature and what we'd expect to see. And then also it further support says, like, if you look at this extrinsic treatment, when you basically, it cuts off this, the indirect effect is 0 because it cuts off this connection between the extrinsic treatment and the warm glow. So that's the mediation analysis. So to recap the results, We find that my first hypothesis is strongly supported. So anticipated warm glow increases in response to the intrinsic treatment, but not in response to the extrinsic treatment. So basically, if you can induce someone to do something pro-environmental out of the goodness of their heart, they actually develop a sense of appreciation for doing things good for the environment. And that's a really interesting finding, because we're finding all of these pieces where all these, all these new studies in the literature are showing, warm glow is super important for pro-environmental behavior. And now I'm showing, actually, if you can nudge people forward to do something pro-environmental, you can actually increase their this anticipated warm glow. So that's really cool. Now, on the hypothesis 2, does the intrinsic treatment translate into an increase in pro-environmental behaviors? The results on that are mixed. So pro-environmental intentions, which is kind of the easier thing to measure and the easier bar to clear, increase in response to that intrinsic treatment, but they don't increase in response to the extrinsic treatment. Reported pro-environmental behaviors do not increase on average for either group. And the mediation analysis provides that experimental support for this theoretical prediction that pro-environmental behaviors increase through this mechanism of warm glow. And so to draw some broader conclusions on this, this study has a number of contributions to, first of all, the pro-environmental behavior literature, which overlaps but is somewhat separate from a lot of the economics literature. It provides more evidence, as we're kind of seeing this growing trend and evidence on this particular question, that warm glow is a really important factor for positive spillovers in pro-environmental behavior. And importantly, that shows that warm glow changes in response to interventions. So it's not a static thing. And that we're demonstrating an experimental method that increases pro-environmental warm glow, which is a first. It also kind of points to this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and the large literature that resides in generally psychology, but has some work in behavioral economics as well. That here's an experimental method that we've been able to theoretically or empirically increase warm glow, so we can study it more carefully. And there's a translation into different types of policies or different types of interventions that you might want to see in the real world if you're wanting to do this on a larger scale. So the contributions to the economics literature. So first of all, we've tested the main proposition of this endogenous preference model for pro-environmental behavior, and we see promising results. And we also have just shown that, or added to the body of evidence that when preferences change in response to policies and interventions, or when relevant behaviors span long time periods, you really need to look at that dynamic utility and look at how preferences change in response to prior behavior or interventions. So that's an important area that I think, and I hope to see. I think I will see, and I hope will come to pass, that a lot more work looking at not just pretending that humans just kind of come fully formed to all of their economic decisions, but understanding that we're dynamic and we change in response to our experiences, and we really need to account for that. So next steps, like this is an early step in what I see as a critical line of research for my own, research trajectory, and also for the importance of climate change. And my first priority is establishing a better measurement of pro-environmental behavior performance. Because a lot of, if you look at the literature, it's kind of a mess, actually. Like we measure all these different things. We have these different indices. They're not so great. Some of them, the stronger ones look at behaviors that don't vary over short periods of time. So what we need, if we're going to be able to use to be able to use experiments to study how these different interventions affect behavior without having to always go back to like field experiments that have, complex designs and are difficult and very expensive to carry out. We need to get a better measurement of pro-environmental behavior performance. And I'll be working on this in the next year to look at basically using what they call a Rausch model framework to develop a measure that makes more sense and that captures the changes that we might see. And more work on that will be forthcoming, so stay tuned. And then to take it back one more step, like why does this matter for the big picture? If we want to slow climate change, we have to build momentum towards transformative change across the globe. And I don't think that's a controversial statement, given the magnitude of the problem. So when you look at positive spillovers, what you can see is if you can drive a little bit of change, that can start to snowball and have a much larger impact than that initial intervention. No spillovers is kind of like, you got the snowball, but it's hitting a brick wall. It's not doing anything after that. And then negative spillovers, you get the very sad snowman who maybe you're getting the positive change over here, but you're actually having negative effects over there. And that's not really going to help us get very far. So that's basically what I have to share with you today. I hope I respected the time limit fairly well, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And if you think of questions later, feel free to reach out to me at my email.
Fantastic. Trisha, thank you so much. That was really illuminating for me. I have some questions. There are some questions starting to come in. Please, folks, if you are have a question or a notion or a response to Trisha's talk, please throw that into the Q&A. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and pose a quick starting question, and then I'm going to move to a couple of the questions that we have coming in through the chat. So I don't know if you want to maybe stop screen share, Trisha,
Yeah, I'm not sure
until we see what sort of questions come through. There we go. Okay, great. So that we are larger than a postage stamp. So my question for you is, it's a little bit methodological. It's this, I think that what's interesting here is that you're looking at a specific activity, right, that folks are doing, right? So they feel good because they have raised a little bit of money, right, for a cause, right? And then that creates a good feeling. But if we're wanting to look at this as something that helps us to motivate, right, more behaviors, I would propose, right, that behaviors have a complex of reasons for them, right? And so how do we judge the degree to which, a warm glow effect can be active, right, in a space where that's competing with other drivers for my behavior, right? So if I, I have to go to a store and the store is, 20 minutes walk away, but a 1 minute drive away, right? How much is my I'm being pressed for time, or I have a child at home, or the store's closing hours is coming. I mean, so how do we recognize, right, that sometimes, and can we overcome, right, some of those other issues that are competing for us with, the good feeling about doing an environmental behavior? Is that anything that you've thought about, how to reckon with in any of the modeling?
Yeah, because I mean, well, the nice thing about economic modeling is the magical word ceteris paribus, which is all other
Right.
people.
That's right.
So we try to isolate this one thing so we can look at the effect of that. And the nice thing is that pairs well with the randomized controlled environment because you can actually do that.
Right.
So through randomization, we're able to kind of control for all those other things and just isolate that effect. Now, I would not argue at all that like we should stop, making it more convenient to do pro-environmental things or basically reducing the barriers, reducing the cost, increasing the social norms, increasing the habits. Like all of these things matter. And even increasing incentives. Like, it's not that, I'm not anti-incentive by any stretch of the imagination. I'm like, but what we can see is that this tells us that there are certain approaches that might actually be counterproductive, like kind of trying to guilt. A lot of the environmental communication, especially in the past, I think we're starting to get it more, but it's based a lot on guilt and trying to make people feel bad about their choices. And when we see people feeling bad about their choices, we see that single action bias. If instead we can make people feel good about their choices and make them like really appreciate the acts of like, what they're doing for the environment, and kind of become like cheerleaders a little bit more instead of just kind of the school marms. I think that that's a frame that can be really useful with how we approach both communication and how we approach even policies. So definitely all those other things still matter. But this is one area, and it's, surprising, and we'll see, like, it's an early, the burgeoning literature on warm glow really is like, has been arising in the past, like, 3 to 4 years. So, we'll see as we continue to see more work on it, how much it matters above other things.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. And it makes me want to ask other questions about policy, but let me make sure that our viewers get in the mix here as well. One question that came through before the talk was actually the question of, how does experience with activism shape motivation and future engagement, right? And so this I think is outside of the scope of your study, right? Because you weren't necessarily looking at previous experience, right, of your participants. But do you have any quick reflections on that as part of the mix?
Yeah, well, I think when you have experience with activism, especially if it's an environmental activism, first of all, there's like an identity aspect there. And you feel really good when you do things that are in line with your identity. And like, you're like, I am a pro-environmental person. I feel great when I'm doing those things. Activism tends to be one of the things higher on that ladder of engagement. So you usually are getting people engaging in activism once they're already pretty high on pro-environmental identity and other measures. But, I think it does say that, like, you can see an increased commitment and an increased level of pro-environmental behavior, especially if you're, there are some activist circles that get criticized for being too like judgy or negative about like, oh, you eat meat, or, oh, like that might have an effect where it discourages people, and they're just like responding to guilt all the time instead of responding to like, I'm trying to act in line with my values, which makes me feel good.
Right.
But I think that likely has an effect. And I think that one other aspect of, with activism is that understanding, like, there's a big debate in the activist circles of like, how much should we be thinking about individual level behavior versus how much should we be thinking about policy change? And like, they have a point, like we have this huge, all of a sudden we're all concerned about our straws, because of that sad turtle video, but like, is it really like, are we really focusing on the right thing if we're like really worried about what straws we're using when then there's all these companies that are polluting? So the question that I'm interested in is, not whether we should do individual behavior or activism, but whether individual behavior actually maybe makes people more likely to engage in activism as they kind of rise up that ladder of engagement.
Great answer. Okay, to our audience questions. Our first question from an anonymous attendee: to summarize, instead of paying my kids, I should make payments to causes they care about and the dishes will get done, right?
That's an interesting approach. Yeah, or at least they'll become more like charity inclined. I don't know if it affects your dishes necessarily, because I don't know if people are like more likely to want to transcribe Shakespeare after doing the study, but but it will probably make them more pro-social based on my study.
Right. This is a very relevant topic for me right now because I just implemented a plan to actually give an allowance for dish doing. So this makes me think twice about
it's terrible because like
this
as a parent,
scheme.
my 7-year-old's asking for the same thing, and I'm like, but intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic, you know. I explained to her, and she doesn't seem to really care.
Works in progress. We are all works in progress.
Exactly.
This next question is from Hunter Snyder, who is a PhD student here at Dartmouth College. And Hunter asks, would it be possible to replicate this study in an energy field setting? And if so, where would you do it? And would you expect that the behavioral responses would vary less or more in a field setting, i.e. with quasi-experimental design, like random treatment control group?
Yeah, so field studies are fantastic, and I fully support, that I think that field studies are a great investment that show like real world behavior. If I were doing this in an energy, that's a good question. In an energy setting, um, I mean, it would be pretty simple if you pay, like if you set up some sort of, you know, just two different types of policy interventions where you're saving energy, maybe they're in some sort of energy saving program, and then maybe their energy savings go to like plant more trees and do more pro-environmental things versus like those energy savings then are paid out to you in terms of like the actual your electricity bill. So maybe you could say like if you donate your energy savings, does that reduce that rebound effect?
Right.
That's my spur of the moment idea.
No, that's interesting. You could even envision, right, that if it's energy savings, maybe the funds are going to a carbon offset program, right, with demonstrated benefits, right, of some kind, right? So it's sort of that reinforcement, positive reinforcement loop.
Right. And it'd be interesting because I mean, what I also you would probably see fewer savings too in the first part, and that's what you kind of have to like hold on for. Just like people in the intrinsic treatment wrote fewer words than people in the extrinsic treatment. So you're actually getting less of that initial behavior, but then when you take the dynamics into effect, you might end up being much better off.
Right.
So there's a trade-off there, and it's way too early in this work to be able to say like where does that come down exactly. But that's a great question, Hunter. Thank you.
Right. So it's that
trade-off.
trade-off.
Doing a quasi-experimental design, let me know because the logistics are always. I've done a few in grad school, but it's always much easier to do online experiments with.
That's right. Yeah. Much more involved. Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is from Greg Sparkman. Greg says, this is a great talk. And do you think that financial incentives can be thoughtfully reframed to avoid crowding out anticipated warm glow, right? So as an example, say, thank you for taking action. It really helps this important cause. We couldn't have done it without you and your dedication. Also, as a thank you for your commitment, please accept this token gift, right? So is there a way to have it your cake and eat it too?
Maybe. Well, I mean, if you look at that, the brain scan study, I forget the name of it already, but you still see an effect when the taxation is required, at least in that for the reward processing. And so I think the framing really would matter. In my particular study, like you don't see that effect, like you see zero movement on the extrinsic group, but this is, I mean, that's like 125 people. So like, it's possible that changing the framing of it is really going to matter. And it's also like, it's a different thing when you're talking about, this is where you're using MTurkers who are there to make money to like support usually they're pretty low income and they're trying to make, so they are more likely to be motivated. Like they're there to make money and that's what they're doing. So that's going to be their key, what they're keen into. That's like their job. Whereas like if you're doing something in the real world, you might see that framing would affect it more because we did do the same framing for the intrinsic and the extrinsic group, and we didn't see that warm glow jump for the extrinsic at all.
Right.
but that doesn't mean that's going to be the case in all scenarios. And there's a lot of reasons why it might be different for this particular experiment.
Well, it's interesting too, though, that you say that this particular group with MTurk, right? They are more predisposed than perhaps the average population, right, to actually prefer, the control situation, right, the extrinsic or the control. And so do you say, right, in your analysis that the fact that you had such a strong impact, right, on the intrinsic treatment,
Mm-hmm.
particularly meaningful, because it may, if you try to transfer the results from that sample to a more broad sample, might you expect, right, a stronger effect?
Right. Yeah, and you might. And initially, so I actually came up with this idea of this experiment like at the beginning of my PhD, and I have just now carried it out, which is interesting. But keep going. But initially I was really into carbon taxes and thinking about like, I wonder, like, if you made that carbon tax more, like, what if instead of hiding it, like, what if you like put a big sign on the gas pump of like, you're contributing to like, pro-environmental whatever, you're planting trees. Now, granted, you'd be a little concerned that they might be like, great, I'm gonna like pump more gas.
Right.
However, it'd be interesting to see, like, does that drive support for further pro-environmental action? Like there's different
Right.
competing directions of how it might go, but it's certainly a cool thing to think about. And I think testing those frames would be really important and interesting.
So I think this is our last question. And Kelly Westcamper asks, since the majority of environmental damage comes from industry and companies, how do you anticipate warm glow and intrinsic motivation, which are inherently individual in scope, impacting industry-wide environmental decisions where individual guilt and warm glow can be spread among many? This is a great closing question. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Yeah, that brings in.
You can do with it in 2 or 3 minutes, okay?
Okay. Yeah, this brings up like a whole range of possible, things to think about and talk about. I think what I could say with the most confidence is that you do see a lot of pro-environmental work from industry is driven by demand from consumers. So by increasing that demand, you might see the effect from industry and changing their environmental impact, or at least greenwashing it more convincingly. But so yeah, I think that would be really interesting to look at and see like whether you can see those individual investors change. But it's like that the investor mindset is so driven by kind of like the MTurkers, where they're like, I'm here for the payout, not for the green warm glow. That varies, and you're seeing like larger increase in like sustainable investing. So I think that this gets to a much bigger question of like how we think about shareholder supremacy, and like this idea of like whether corporations are should be driven and motivated by pro-social, pro-community, pro-globe considerations, or whether they should always just be driven by the bottom line. And I have my own opinions on that, but I don't think my work necessarily, like, sure, you could like get some CEOs into the room and see if it affects, you might be able to do some like interesting field studies on that, but I'm not as confident that it would have as strong of an impact, given that the structure of the decision making on that is so as Kelly mentions, is so driven by profit rather than warm glow. So that's like a cultural change that I would love to see. But yeah, I mean, in the end, they're all decision makers, but it's going to be harder to shift that given the dynamics.
Right. I think part of the reason I like that as a closing question is the way that it provokes us to think a little bit about the unit of analysis, right? And where is that a unit of analysis most relevant? And I agree that a study, or a study rather than an intervention, right, at the level of various decision makers within corporate frameworks. I mean, we think about corporations sometimes as these big conglomerates, and they are, but they are also, I mean, there are people in those organizations, right? And and how does helping to, shift or engage, right, with individual feelings and being in alignment with your values, how does that within an organizational framework, how what impacts could that have, right, in context of values and performance.
Yeah, and in terms of business model, like just look at in terms of business models, if you look at the buy one, give one model that's become so popular, from like, socks to like, Tom's is kind of the number one, well known for that. That's a really good example of like allowing your consumers to get that warm glow from their purchase in a really direct and tangible
Right.
way. And
Right.
that has been, because it's been replicated, so it's become such a popular model. I think that is in response to that demand, which probably ties back to warm glow.
Trisha, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting journey with you through the combination of behavioral economics and how that brings psychology into the mix and neuroscience even into the mix. And I really applaud your experimental and fully empirical approach to it. And we look forward to watching what comes next out of you and your shop right along these lines. So thank you again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great, excellent questions, and hopefully I'll be attending these more in the future.
We would love that. Thank you, Trisha. With that, thank you again for being here. Thank you so much to Trisha, and everyone have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.